everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Heather and today I am back with Humidity, a continuing saga. No, I'm just kidding. Today I am back with a little bit of a belated mid-year book, Freakout Tag. I haven't done this one in a few years, I don't think, but I thought it'd be kind of interesting to do, especially since I saw a semi-edited version on Shelley Swearingen's channel, which was created by, let me check my notes to get all the people, created by Steve Donahue, David, and of course the original was done by Books and Lala. I will credit all of those people down below. I couldn't quite answer all of the questions. There were some that were just really tough for me, so I'm going to ignore those and just tell you about the ones that I could come up with answers for. So the first question is quite general. How's your reading going? And honestly, it's going pretty well. There have been peaks, there have been valleys, but overall, pretty good year. The second question is the best book you've read so far this year, which should be an easy question, and I have come up with books. But there are two problems. As any avid reader knows, you will hit a point where these are my favorite books of the year so far right now. If you ask me 2 days from now, my answers could be entirely different. In addition, I seem to have lost all sense of time, and what I read this year versus last year is very fuzzy right now. So these were the ones that I could come up with as, yes, I have definitely read them within the year of 2024. And those were The Last Chronicle of Barset. I adored this book. This was the best way that Trollope could have ended the series. Felt very modern, but very classic at the same time, and getting to spend all that time with all of those characters from all of the rest of the series and still see them grow and develop in this last one was just incredible. I still can't get over it. As well as my two favorite romance series, both had new books out at the beginning of this year. So The Gentleman's Gambit was the final in the Extraordinary Women series by Evie Dunmore, which is set in Oxford following 4 friends who are all suffragettes and their various romantic endeavors. This last one was fantastic, as have the rest of the series been, and it was a really wonderful way to round off that series. And also The Lily of Ludgate Hill, which was book 3 in the Bells of London series by Mimi Matthews. This is more of a clean romance. The Evie Dunmores are not. They are very spicy. But this was also delightful. Also a Victorian romance following 4 friends, this time 4 friends who are all equestrians, but at very different points in life. Not necessarily points, but in different circumstances in life. But how they all find love anyway amid those circumstances. Also, I'm noticing that all of the favorites I chose right now were all Victorian in some way. Am I craving fall? Quite possibly. Given everything I just said, my answer to the best sequel I've read this year has to go to Last Chronicle of Barset, for all the reasons I just described. I'm not going to rave at you anymore about it. Read it yourself, despite its massive size. Next, what's a new release that you haven't read yet, but that you really, really want to read? Of all the books I've talked about, in fact, I have a book haul coming up probably next week, so stay tuned for that, and I'm really excited about a lot of the books in that haul. But one that's not a super recent release, but one that was released fairly recently, that I've been looking for, but I just haven't found it yet, is The Secret Diary of Charles Ignatius Sancho by Patterson Joseph. Everyone raved about this book. I think it looks amazing, and it is historical fiction about a real figure, Charles Ignatius Sancho, who I believe was the first Black man to be given the right to vote in England. So it's definitely 1700s, possibly Georgian, late Georgian Regency, I need that in my life. And the second part is your most anticipated release for the second half of the year. I don't really keep up with when new releases are coming out. I tend to just be surprised when I see them on shelves or in people's halls. But one that I do know that's being published in October is the new Susanna Clarke, whose title I want to get right. The Wood at Midwinter. Because not only is it a new Susanna Clarke, but it's set in the same universe as Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which I adore. So yes, desperately looking forward to that. What books do you need to read before the end of the year? Definitely more Trollope, given my growing love for him that was sparked this year. I desperately want to work my way through more and more of his work. Apart from that, I'm going to refer you to my video from a few weeks ago called On Reading Decisions. That's going to tell you more about my thought process about picking what to read next. Next, what is a genre that you've been reading a lot of or loving the most right now? I think I would have to say historical romance, or quite simply romance in general. It may not be a genre that I'm loving the most at the moment, but it is one that I find myself reading a lot more of than I have in previous years. And for the most part, I'm really enjoying what I'm finding. On the opposite end of the scale, what were your biggest disappointments of the year so far? And for this, I would have to say 3. My first audiobook of the year was a major disappointment, and that was One Day in December by Josie Silver. I thought this had everything that I could want to start the year. It was narrated by Eleanor Tomlinson, who was in Poldark. It's set in London over the Christmas season, at least to start. It's a lovely romance. I thought, oh, this is going to be perfect. Once we got outside of the premise and saw the development of this love story, I hated it. I hated it. I hated all the characters. I hated every decision they made. Every time I thought, well, maybe it's gonna get better from here. No, it didn't. They still made the wrong decision. Not a success, although I did still listen to it all the way to the end just to see what the final outcome was going to be and if I was going to be happy with it or not. It was slightly better than I thought it was going to be, but even so, there was just so much really negative messaging about relationships, why you should get married, why you should have children. It made me deeply uncomfortable. The next 2 were DNFs for me. The next one was Wicked by Gregory Maguire. I tried to read it and I couldn't do it, mainly because 1, it went so slowly, and 2, I haven't seen the musical. I am very much looking forward to the film, but based on what I know of the musical, being as big of a Broadway nerd as I am, I couldn't escape not knowing something about the musical. And based on that, to me, the message of the musical is how society makes monsters, that Elphaba is not inherently evil, but she is put in a position where she has to play the villain over time. And she is vilified for being different, and so on and so forth. But to me, reading this book, and keep in mind I only read the section where Elphaba is maybe under 2, but she's always written in a way that Maguire is suggesting that there was always something inherently evil about her, something wrong, something. And to me, that undercuts the entire point that he's trying to make with this novel. So I just gave up. I couldn't take it. And finally, my last DNF was Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead. It was written beautifully, so I can see why it was nominated for so many awards and why it has become a booktube darling. But it just wasn't for me. I couldn't identify with anything that either of the heroines were going through, and it was just taking far too long for anyone to hit the aviation phase of the book. So I gave up on that one. For my biggest surprise of the year, I would have to say two different answers once again. My first surprise was how much I enjoyed the ACOTAR series by Sarah J. Maas, which is, if you're unfamiliar, the Court of Thorns and Roses series. I was recommended these by a lot of people over the years, but finally it became the case that all the teachers my age at school had read them. So I had to join in to find out what they were on about. And I really enjoyed it. At first, I loved book one in terms of looking at how it was playing with the Beauty and the Beast tropes. And then the twist in book two, I thought was pretty fantastic and made me want to reread book one and look for all those clues. It was really fantastic. And then, of course, I was sucked in, had to finish the rest of the series. My second biggest surprise was Pepper Basham as an author. Now, I've only read one of her books so far, and that was Loyally Luke, which I had an arc of through NetGalley. And I'll refer you back to my May wrap-up for more of my thoughts. But as someone who is Christian but doesn't tend to read a lot of marketed Christian fiction, it was a really pleasant surprise in terms of it not being incredibly preachy. It was an incredibly realistic portrayal of how everyday Christians live their lives. And that was just so refreshing and wonderful to see. So I'm hoping to read the first two books in that series at some point. Because I can get them out digitally through the library, I haven't quite decided how they're going to fit in. Number 8 is a favorite new author. This could be brand new or just new to you. And much as those authors were surprises, I wouldn't say that they were favorites. I developed a deep love for Trollope this year, but I have read him previously, so I don't know if he entirely counts. So I'm going to just mention D.E. Stevenson. Hold on, I have a D.E. Stevenson here. So I am counting D.E. Stevenson as my new favorite author of the year. She is not new, but she is new to me. I read Miss Bunkle's book in December of 2023, so I'm counting that as close enough. And I've read another of her books every single month up until June. Couldn't quite fit them in June and July, but I'm getting back on track. These are just delightfully sweet. I still think Miss Bunkle's book is my favorite, but I love diving into these cozy communities that she creates, writing women's fiction in the 1930s and 40s. They're usually set but anywhere between the 1920s and 40s and are just delightful, life-softening books. Number 9, how does your reading break down in terms of mechanism? So in terms of print versus audiobook versus ebook. And I'm really not entirely sure. I do keep track. I have an entire spreadsheet that a website put out, and I can't remember which one it was now, but I've been using it for a couple of years. It looks like this. The website has stopped publishing it. They only made it for 1 year, but I've just made a copy of the spreadsheet every year and changed a few of the data inputs so that it will keep calculating correctly. So in terms of that, I can break it down. There it is. I can break down my reading by many different data, including audio versus digital versus print. But this tracker and indeed Storygraph's tracker aren't entirely accurate for me because trying to work through such massive books as Trollope means that I have started loving the read a book in print and on audiobook at the same time, and when I come home from work, move the bookmark based on how much I've listened to. So in my trackers, I tend to count the print book because I am working my way through the print book and I have a physical copy. But because I'm using two methods to get through that story, the number of audiobooks I'm reading is in fact higher than what that shows. So despite having data, I don't have actual data. But I am listening to far more audiobooks than I have in the past because I'm using that method. And I'm still reading some digitally. I am reading slightly less digitally just because my life has gotten busier. I'm not reading as many arcs as I have in years past. So it's still mainly print, but with those two exceptions. The next question was a book that made you happy. I didn't have any books that made me cry or one specific new favorite character, but I did have many books that made me happy, including all of the favorite books that I've mentioned already, and including The Winter Rose by Jennifer Donnelly, which I don't have on hand at the moment. But this is part of a trilogy that started with The Tea Rose, which I read when I was in university, my first year. It was my roommate's favorite book, and it looks like it still is, because based on her Goodreads activity, she just reread it, so yay Ellie, go us. But this year I finally started reading the sequels, and The Winter Rose was fantastic, considering it had been well over a decade since I read the first book. The Winter Rose pulled me right back into the story. I remembered immediately how much I loved Fiona and Jo, and I grew to love all of the new characters that we were also following. It was just fantastic. Sucked me in. The villain is horrible, and yet you can understand why he's doing what he's doing. It doesn't make it right. It doesn't mean you like him, but he is absolutely believable. It is perfect. These are stories that are primarily romances, but they are set in the late early 1900s. The first one follows Fiona and Jo, who have to work their way up from a very poor background. They are desperately in love, but they are separated a number of times by a number of different factors. Along the way, they are trying to establish businesses for themselves to try and better themselves, and it's just fantastic. This second book follows a relation of Fiona's, which is as much as I can say about that without spoiling various things, along with the new character of Dr. India Selwyn, or India Selwyn Jones. I forget if she was hyphenated, but India is delightful. She comes from a very wealthy family, hence her being allowed to go to university to train as a doctor. But in an age where female doctors were very, very new, she decides to go into philanthropic medicine and join a firm in a very poor part of, I believe, the East End of London, and discovers that this is not all that she thought it would be. This is so much harder than she thought. Huge amounts of drama ensue, but it's never quite unbelievable. It always stays just this side of melodrama. They are fantastic. Slightly spicy, but that's not the overall point of them. There's so much more to them as well. And then the last question that I could come up with an answer for at the time was some content creators that you've been loving recently. And I have several answers for this. Of course, I am subscribed to many of you watching as well as many other channels, and I still adore them. But some new to me creators were, first of all, Karla at Karla Likes to Read. But Karla is doing fantastic work. We've been corresponding quite a lot. We have very similar taste. And yeah, she's just been delightful, very thoughtful, quiet responses. And in the same vein is Aisling, and I will link all of these creators down below because that's all there is to Aisling's channel name. But she is also delightful. As you may have guessed, she is from Ireland, and she reads quite a variety of books, slightly more fantasy than I do, but it's still delightful to hear her thoughts about anything that she reads, even if it's not my taste personally, because again, it's very quiet, very thoughtful, and really interesting reviews of any book that she talks about. Then there's also Laolu, and I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly, who used to be Becoming Laolu. She is now going by the channel name of Banjo Biblioteca. She hasn't been posting much, which I'm very disappointed by because I love her ideas. Her creativity in terms of video themes is unmatched, I think. I particularly enjoyed a fairly recent video where, as one of the questions on her dating profile, she asked men to tell her about their favorite and or least favorite book and what she thought she could infer about those potential dates from that and whether or not she should date them. She is incredibly smart and very sassy in the best possible way. And they're just a lot of fun, and I really enjoy what she posts when she manages to post. Then another two channels that are not new, but they were new to me this year, were Shelley Swearingen, who I discovered through the historical fiction readathon in June. And again, very lovely person. We tend to read a lot of the same things. And she also comes up with some really creative ideas, including an entire readathon, which I wish I felt as inspired to create my own readathon. And lastly, there's Roz from Scallydandling About the Books, who I heard about for years, and of course through Victober and various other readathons that she's involved with, but I finally subscribed this year. I finally get it. She is fantastic. Funny, thoughtful, insightful. I love her work. So that is a basic summary of my reading year thus far. Of course, there is so much more to read, but honestly, that's a fantastic problem to have. I can't wait to go downstairs and get stuck into my book, which I think I'm going to love if I can really get into that first 100 pages. It's our mutual friend, by the way, so there's a lot more to go after those first 100 pages. But let me know down below what you have been reading this summer. If you have created your own mid-year freakout tag, you can link the video. I am so behind on my subscriptions, so I can't guarantee that I'll get to it very quickly, but do leave them there because I'd love to know nonetheless. And apologies if there's been any background noise from my neighborhood. I have been waiting all day to film, and as soon as I sat down, generators started running, lawnmowers started going, dogs started howling, so I'm terribly sorry if the camera picked any of that up. But until next time, be safe, be well, and happy reading. Bye everyone.